Number 1. Michael Jace. He was the kind of actor people recognized instantly, even if they couldn't always remember his name. On screen, Michael Jace had a calm presence, often cast as the steady police officer or the loyal friend. He was best known for his role as Officer Julianne Lowe on the television drama The Shield. For fans, he was a familiar face in living rooms across America throughout the 2000s. But behind the Hollywood career and the roles that built his reputation, there was another story unfolding, one that would end in tragedy and leave audiences stunned that the man they thought they knew could carry such darkness into his personal life. Before crime ever entered the picture, Jace seemed to live a life most would envy. Born in Peterson, New Jersey, in 1962, he worked his way into acting through persistence and talent. His resume filled steadily, with appearances in films like Forrest Gump and The Replacements, along with steady television work. To the outside world, he appeared to have achieved stability, a steady job, a family, and a respected place in Hollywood. Friends and colleagues described him as soft-spoken and professional. But those closest to him later testified that beneath the surface, he was struggling, financially, emotionally, and within his marriage. By 2014, those tensions would erupt in the most shocking way. On the evening of May 19th, 2014, in Los Angeles, a call came into 911 from a quiet suburban neighborhood. Michael Jace himself was on the line, telling the operator something almost unthinkable. He had shot his wife, April. When police arrived, they found April Jace inside the home, fatally wounded. Their 2 young sons had been inside the house at the time. The image of the actor once known for portraying a peace officer, now confessing to taking his wife's life, shook the community. Neighbors described hearing an argument before the sound of gunfire. What had seemed like another ordinary night in their home ended in irreversible tragedy. The investigation quickly centered on Jace's financial stress and marital problems. Records showed that he was facing mounting debt, including bankruptcy, and the couple's marriage had become strained. Detectives pieced together a picture of a relationship under immense pressure. As they searched the house, interviewed family, and traced April's last moments, a troubling timeline emerged. Witnesses recounted how April had been an active, loving mother involved with her church and her children's school. Friends described her as vibrant and dedicated. To them, her loss was almost too painful to process, and the fact that her husband admitted responsibility made it even harder to understand. The legal process moved forward quickly. Jace was arrested and charged with murder, and from the start, the prosecution argued that the killing was deliberate. They highlighted his confession, the financial troubles, and the evidence that the couple's relationship had been unraveling. The defense did not deny that he had pulled the trigger, but they attempted to frame the act as something less than premeditated, a moment of rage, not a calculated decision. The trial drew media attention because of Jace's fame, but also because of the contrast between his public image and the crime he stood accused of. Each day in court revealed more details about his life, his debts, and the strain of trying to maintain appearances while struggling behind closed doors. In May 2016, after 2 years of legal proceedings, the verdict was handed down. Michael Jace was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury concluded that while the act had not been fully planned in advance, it was intentional and carried out with malice. For April's family and the couple's children, the verdict brought some sense of justice, though it could not undo the loss. The court sentenced Jace to 40 years to life in prison. He would be eligible for parole only after decades behind bars, by which time he would be an elderly man. Today, Michael Jace remains in a California state prison, serving his sentence. His sons, once present in the house on that tragic night, have grown up without their mother and with their father incarcerated for taking her life. For many who knew April, the pain of her absence remains raw. And for fans of The Shield and his other work, the case stands as a haunting reminder that the characters we see on screen can mask very different realities off screen. Imagine watching a show where the actor playing a police officer is meant to represent protection and law, only to learn that in his own home he had done the very opposite. It forces us to reckon with how little we truly know about the people we admire from afar. Michael Jace's downfall is not just the story of an actor who lost everything, but of a family shattered and a community left questioning how a man who seemed composed and professional could commit an act so devastating. In the end, the story circles back to April, the person who should be remembered most. She was more than the victim of a crime. She was a mother, a friend, and a presence whose life mattered deeply to those around her. Her story is what lingers when the cameras fade and the court proceedings close. It reminds us that behind every headline and every conviction is a human life taken, and families left to pick up the pieces. Number 2, Skylar Deleon. At first glance, Skylar Deleon's name might not mean much. He wasn't a Hollywood star, nor did he have a long list of recognizable roles. His most famous appearance was as a child extra on Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, barely a blip in the world of television. But years later, his name would resurface, not in credits or film listings, but in headlines that stunned the public. By then, Deleon wasn't remembered as a hopeful actor. He was known as the mastermind behind one of the most shocking murder-for-profit plots in California's history. Skylar Deleon was born John Julius Jacobson Jr. in 1979 in Southern California. His childhood was turbulent. He reportedly struggled with his sense of identity, shifting ambitions, and financial instability from a young age. Acting gave him a brief taste of recognition, but it never developed into a career. As he grew older, he faced mounting debt and a string of poor decisions. He married Jennifer Henderson, and the two built a life that, at least from the outside, looked like a family trying to stay afloat. But behind the scenes, Deleon was driven by desperation. He dreamed of wealth and a fresh start, and in 2004, he set his sights on a retired couple whose lives seemed to represent everything he wanted. Thomas and Jackie Hawks were a loving pair in their 50s who had spent years working hard, raising a family, and eventually buying a 55-foot yacht called the Well-Deserved. For them, the yacht symbolized retirement and freedom. They had sailed across the West Coast and made unforgettable memories. By 2004, however, they were ready to sell the boat and settle on land to spend more time with their first grandchild. When Skylar Deleon appeared, presenting himself as a serious buyer, they thought they had found a match. He visited with his wife, Jennifer, and played the part of a family man looking for the perfect vessel. The Hawks welcomed him aboard, not realizing this was the beginning of a carefully laid trap. On November 15, 2004, Skylar and Jennifer arranged to meet the Hawks on their yacht in Newport Beach. But Deleon didn't come alone. He brought along accomplices, including an old friend named John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who had a violent criminal past. Once on board, what should have been a friendly test run turned into a nightmare. The group overpowered Thomas and Jackie, forcing them to sign documents transferring ownership of the yacht. Then, in a crime that shocked investigators for its cruelty, they tied the couple to an anchor and pushed them overboard into the Pacific Ocean. The Hawks vanished beneath the waves, leaving no trace. Their yacht, however, returned to shore, and the paper trail they had been forced to sign would later unravel Deleon's scheme. At first, the disappearance was puzzling. The Hawks were devoted parents and grandparents, unlikely to vanish voluntarily. Their family raised alarms quickly, reporting them missing and insisting something was wrong. Detectives began to dig into the yacht sale and soon uncovered inconsistencies. Skylar Deleon's sudden claim to ownership raised immediate suspicion. His financial troubles didn't match the image of a wealthy buyer, and his story began to crumble under questioning. Witness statements, cell phone records, and financial documents revealed that the sale was a sham designed to cover up a brutal double killing. The Hawks' bodies were never recovered, but the evidence left behind was overwhelming. By 2005, Skylar Deleon was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including financial gain. Jennifer Henderson was charged as an accomplice, along with Kennedy and others involved in the plot. The trial was closely followed by the media. Prosecutors painted Deleon as manipulative and cold, willing to destroy 2 lives for money and a lifestyle he could never earn legitimately. The defense tried to raise arguments about his troubled background and personal struggles, but the details of the crime were too stark to ignore. In 2008, the verdict came down. Skylar Deleon was convicted on all counts. The jury found that the killings were premeditated, calculated acts carried out for profit. He was sentenced to death and remains on death row in California's San Quentin prison. His accomplices also faced heavy sentences, with John Fitzgerald Kennedy receiving the death penalty as well. Jennifer Henderson, his wife, was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Even today, the story of the Hawks resonates with many because of how ordinary and kind they were. They had worked hard to achieve a dream, the freedom of the open sea, the joy of retirement, the warmth of family life. And in one afternoon, all of that was stolen by someone who wanted shortcuts to wealth and a new life. Imagine selling your home or your possessions and trusting a buyer, never imagining that trust could cost you everything. That is the chilling reality of what happened aboard the Well-Deserved. Reflecting on this case, it's difficult not to see the tragic irony. Skylar Deleon once brushed against Hollywood, standing briefly in the background of a show built around heroes battling villains. Yet in his own life, he chose to play the role of the villain to its darkest extreme. His story is not one of celebrity success, but of how greed and deception can lead to decisions that ruin countless lives, including his own. The names that deserve to be remembered here are Thomas and Jackie Hawks, a couple whose lives embodied love, adventure, and family, and whose loss left a permanent scar on everyone who knew them. Number 3, Phil Spector. For decades, Phil Spector was hailed as a musical genius. He built his reputation as one of the most innovative record producers in the industry, creating the wall of sound that shaped pop music in the 1960s. He worked with the Ronettes, the Crystals, the Beatles, and countless others. To the public, Spector was a towering figure in music history, someone who had changed the sound of an era. But behind the accolades and the carefully crafted image, there was another side to him. Those who knew him often spoke about his volatile temper, his controlling nature, and his obsession with firearms. These warning signs would eventually culminate in a crime that ended not only his career, but his freedom. Born in New York City in 1939, Harvey Philip Spector grew up in a household marked by hardship. His father's suicide when he was a child cast a long shadow over his life, and by his teenage years, Spector had turned to music as both an escape and a way to define himself. He formed a group called the Teddy Bears, scoring a #1 hit with "To Know Him Is to Love Him" while still in high school. From there, his rise was meteoric. By his 20s, he was producing chart-topping records and becoming one of the most sought-after figures in the industry. But as the years went on, his reputation became increasingly complicated. Stories circulated of his mood swings, his paranoia, and his tendency to keep guns close at hand. Those close to him described a man who could shift from charming to threatening in an instant. By the early 2000s, Spector lived in a lavish mansion known as the Pyrenees Castle in Alhambra, California. It was there, on February 3rd, 2003, that his life would change forever. That evening, Spector met Lana Clarkson, a 40-year-old actress and model, at the House of Blues on Sunset Boulevard. Clarkson, known for her roles in 1980s films, had recently been working as a hostess at the club. Spector invited her back to his estate after the club closed, and she agreed. The night that followed ended in tragedy. Just after dawn, Spector's chauffeur, waiting outside the mansion, heard a gunshot. Minutes later, Spector walked outside with a pistol in his hand and reportedly said, "I think I just killed somebody." Inside, Lana Clarkson was found dead from a gunshot wound to the face. The scene left investigators with few doubts. Something had gone terribly wrong inside that house. Spector initially claimed her death had been an accidental suicide, insisting she had taken her own life. But the evidence told a different story. The investigation revealed that Spector had a long history of threatening women with firearms. Several past girlfriends and acquaintances came forward with accounts of him pointing guns at them during arguments. The prosecution used these stories to paint a picture of a man who had a pattern of intimidation and control, especially when alcohol was involved. Clarkson's friends described her as upbeat and focused on her career. None believed she was suicidal. For investigators, the puzzle pieces aligned toward a clear conclusion. Phil Spector had pulled the trigger. The trial that followed was one of the most high-profile celebrity cases of the decade. His first trial, in 2007, ended with a hung jury after months of testimony. But in 2009, prosecutors retried him, presenting evidence of his past behavior and reinforcing the inconsistencies in his defense. The defense argued that Clarkson had ended her own life, pointing to the lack of eyewitnesses and raising questions about forensic details. Yet, the jury was unconvinced. In April 2009, Phil Spector was found guilty of second-degree murder. At sentencing, the court imposed 19 years to life in prison. He was ordered to serve at least 19 years before he could be considered for parole, meaning he would be in his 80s before he had a chance at release. For someone once celebrated as one of music's greatest visionaries, it was a stunning downfall. Phil Spector spent the remainder of his life behind bars, his health declining over time. In January 2021, he died in a California prison hospital at the age of 81. By then, his musical legacy had been permanently overshadowed by the crime that defined his later years. Imagine this. The man who once shaped the soundtrack of the 1960s, who produced iconic songs that still echo on radios today, lived out his final years in a prison cell. His story is a sharp reminder that brilliance in one part of life cannot erase the damage caused by violence in another. For Lana Clarkson's family and friends, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but it could never restore the life taken so suddenly. Looking back, Phil Spector's legacy is not just about the music he made, but also about the darker truth of who he was away from the studio. It's a reminder that fame and genius can hide destructive flaws, and that even those who seem larger than life are accountable for their actions. Number 4. Corey Miller. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Corey Miller, better known by his stage name C-Murder, was at the height of his fame. As part of the No Limit Records label, founded by his brother Master P, he was a key figure in the Southern rap movement. His albums charted, his music videos played on TV, and he toured across the country, building a fan base that saw him as both a talented artist and a voice from the streets. But even as his career flourished, Miller's life outside the studio was more complicated. His name would soon be linked not to music charts, but to a tragic killing that ended in a courtroom, with a guilty verdict that has kept him behind bars for decades. Born in 1971 in New Orleans, Louisiana, Corey Miller grew up in a family where music was both an outlet and an opportunity. Alongside his brothers, Percy Master P. Miller and Vishon Silk the Shocker Miller, Corey became part of a hip-hop dynasty that put New Orleans firmly on the rap map. His albums, including Life or Death and Bassolini, showcased his aggressive style and raw storytelling. To his fans, C Murder was authentic, someone who spoke from real experience. But away from the stage, his life intersected with the same dangers and conflicts he often rapped about. The crime that would change everything took place on the night of January 12, 2002. Corey Miller was at the Platinum Club, a nightclub in Harvey, Louisiana, just across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. The club was packed, filled with music, energy, and tension. At some point in the night, a fight broke out. In the chaos, a 16-year-old named Steve Thomas was beaten and then fatally shot. Witnesses placed Miller at the scene, and his presence as a high-profile figure immediately drew attention. In the days that followed, investigators began piecing together the events, and the name C Murder quickly shifted from headlines in the entertainment section to the front page of crime reports. The investigation revealed conflicting stories, but several witnesses claimed Miller was directly responsible for firing the shot that killed Thomas. The young victim was described as a fan, someone who admired Miller's music, making the crime all the more devastating to his family. Detectives noted the difficulty of untangling events in a crowded nightclub where alcohol, loud music, and dozens of people made clear recollections hard to come by. Still, enough evidence mounted for prosecutors to charge Miller with second-degree murder. The legal process that followed was long, messy, and controversial. His first trial, in 2003, ended in a conviction and a mandatory life sentence. But that verdict was later overturned after it came out that prosecutors had withheld criminal background information on witnesses. In 2009, Miller was retried, and once again, the courtroom filled with conflicting testimonies, retractions, and questions about credibility. This time, however, the jury returned another guilty verdict. Miller was sentenced again to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout both trials, Miller maintained his innocence. His defense argued that unreliable witnesses, some pressured or incentivized, had built a false picture of what happened. Supporters pointed to inconsistencies, with some witnesses later recanting their statements. High-profile advocates, including Kim Kardashian, have since pushed for his release, citing concerns over fairness and possible misconduct. Despite these efforts, the courts have upheld his conviction, leaving him to serve his sentence at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola. Today, Corey Miller continues to record music from prison, releasing songs and albums that reach his loyal fan base. His story has become one of both tragedy and controversy. Tragedy because a teenager lost his life in a senseless act of violence, and controversy because questions still linger about whether Miller truly received a fair trial. Imagine being a young fan, excited to see a performer you admire, only for that night to end in chaos and death. Imagine being a community watching one of its brightest stars, someone who rose out of poverty to fame, fall back into the cycle of crime and punishment. For Steve Thomas's family, the focus remains on the life that was taken, a son who never came home. For Miller's supporters, the focus is on the flaws in the system and the possibility of wrongful conviction. In the end, the case of C Murder sits at a difficult intersection of fame, violence, and justice. It forces the question of how much we can separate the artist from the man, and how the glare of celebrity can sometimes cloud or intensify the pursuit of truth. For Corey Miller, the name C Murder once just a rap moniker, became a label that defined his life in ways he could never escape. Number 5. Aaron Hernandez. Aaron Hernandez was supposed to be a superstar. Born in 1989 in Bristol, Connecticut, he showed athletic promise from a young age. By high school, he was already a standout football player, and by college, he was a tight end for the University of Florida Gators, helping them win a national championship in 2009. In 2010, he was drafted into the NFL by the New England Patriots, where he quickly became one of Tom Brady's go-to targets. At only 22 years old, he signed a 5-year, $40 million contract extension, the kind of deal that suggested he'd be a household name for years to come. But behind the glamour of pro sports and the cheers of the stadium crowds, Aaron Hernandez lived a very different life. It was a life marked by volatile relationships, impulsive decisions, and connections to crime that would eventually destroy his career and his freedom. Despite his success, Hernandez struggled to leave behind the influences of his past. He had been raised in a household where violence and instability often loomed, and though football gave him structure, his off-the-field choices revealed a darker side. Reports described him as charming in public, but prone to paranoia and bursts of aggression. He surrounded himself with friends who had criminal backgrounds, and despite his wealth and opportunity, he seemed drawn back into dangerous environments. For the Patriots, his potential on the field was undeniable, but for those who knew him personally, there was always a sense of looming trouble. That trouble came to light in June 2013. On June 17th, the body of Odin Lloyd, a 27-year-old semi-professional football player, was found in an industrial park just a mile from Hernandez's mansion in North Attleboro, Massachusetts. Lloyd was dating the sister of Hernandez's fiancée, which made his connection to Hernandez personal as well as social. Lloyd had been shot multiple times, and suspicion quickly fell on the NFL star. Surveillance footage, text messages, and cell phone records soon painted a disturbing picture. Hours before his death, Lloyd had been in contact with Hernandez, and the evidence suggested Hernandez had lured him out that night. As police closed in, the details became impossible to ignore. Surveillance cameras at Hernandez's own home showed him holding a gun shortly after Lloyd's killing. Texts between Hernandez and friends lined up with the timeline of events. Within days, Hernandez was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. For the Patriots, the news was devastating. Within hours of his arrest, the team released him, cutting ties with a player once seen as central to their future. For fans, it was surreal. An NFL star in handcuffs, charged with killing someone connected to his own family. The trial began in 2015 and drew national attention. The prosecution argued that Hernandez had orchestrated the killing after a dispute with Lloyd, driven by a mix of anger, paranoia, and fear of betrayal. They presented evidence of his movements that night, including security footage, ballistic matches, and eyewitness accounts that tied him to the crime. The defense attempted to raise doubts, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial and that Hernandez's friends might have been responsible. But the jury found the case compelling. On April 15, 2015, Hernandez was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction shocked the sports world. Just a few years earlier, Hernandez had been celebrated as one of the NFL's rising stars, a young man with extraordinary athletic ability and a multi-million-dollar future. Now, he was a convicted killer, his career over before his 26th birthday. The trial revealed not just the crime, but also the duality of his life, the disciplined athlete on the field, and the reckless, dangerous man away from it. Hernandez's legal troubles didn't end there. He was later tried in connection with a separate double killing in Boston in 2012, though he was acquitted of those charges. By then, however, the damage to his life and legacy was irreversible. In 2017, just 2 years into his life sentence, Hernandez was found dead in his prison cell, ruled a suicide. His death closed the chapter on a story that had already spiraled beyond comprehension. Imagine the arc of his life, from a boy who dreamed of making it big in football to a man who had achieved everything most athletes only dream of, only to throw it all away in a single night of violence. For Odin Lloyd's family, the pain of their loss never faded. For fans of football, the case became a chilling reminder that athletic talent and fame can't protect someone from the consequences of their choices. Aaron Hernandez's name now stands not as a symbol of NFL greatness, but as a cautionary tale. It's the story of wasted potential, of lives cut short, and of how the choices we make can erase even the brightest future. Number 6. John DuPont. For much of his life, John DuPont was defined by privilege. He was born in 1938 into one of America's wealthiest families, heirs to the DuPont chemical fortune. Raised on sprawling estates, educated at elite schools, and surrounded by opportunity, he seemed destined for a life of comfort and acclaim. But wealth did not shield him from inner struggles. He grew into a man who was eccentric, often reclusive, and plagued by paranoia. Over time, his name became tied to both sports and philanthropy. He donated millions to wrestling, swimming, and other Olympic programs. Yet all of that was overshadowed by a shocking crime in 1996, when DuPont turned his own estate into the scene of a killing that stunned both the sports world and the public. John DuPont had always pursued a fascination with athletics. He built a state-of-the-art wrestling facility on his 800-acre Foxcatcher Farm estate in Pennsylvania. There, he funded and trained some of the nation's best wrestlers, giving them resources few others could provide. Olympic champions like Mark and Dave Schultz trained under his sponsorship. For years, he was viewed as an eccentric benefactor, socially awkward, but generous with his wealth. Athletes tolerated his quirks in exchange for his support. But beneath the surface, DuPont's behavior was becoming more erratic. He developed obsessions with conspiracy theories, carried firearms constantly, and grew increasingly distrustful of those around him. By the mid-1990s, wrestlers and coaches whispered concerns about his mental health. He would accuse people of plotting against him, claim that invisible enemies were invading his home, and isolate himself in paranoia. Despite these red flags, few imagined that his instability would escalate into deadly violence. On January the 26th, 1996, those fears became reality. That morning, DuPont drove to the home of Olympic wrestler Dave Schultz, who lived with his family on the Foxcatcher property. Without warning, DuPont shot Schultz 3 times in front of his wife and others. Schultz, a beloved coach and mentor in the wrestling community, died at the scene. The killing was both sudden and senseless, leaving everyone who knew the DuPont family's benefactor stunned. The aftermath turned into a standoff that captivated the nation. After the shooting, John DuPont barricaded himself inside his mansion. For 2 days, law enforcement surrounded the estate, negotiating with him and trying to coax him out without further bloodshed. The standoff ended peacefully when officers managed to cut off his power and lure him outside. He was arrested and taken into custody, leaving behind a scene that combined wealth, eccentricity, and shocking violence in a way the public struggled to understand. The trial began in 1997, and the central question wasn't whether DuPont had killed Dave Schultz. He had done so in front of witnesses. The question was whether he was legally sane at the time. The defense argued that DuPont suffered from severe mental illness, citing his delusions and paranoia. They pushed for an insanity verdict, which would place him in psychiatric care, rather than prison. The prosecution, however, emphasized that he had planned the shooting, armed himself deliberately, and carried out the act in full awareness of what he was doing. After hearing weeks of testimony, the jury reached a middle ground. They rejected the insanity defense but acknowledged his mental illness, convicting him of third-degree murder. The verdict meant he was held responsible, though not at the highest degree of culpability. The judge sentenced him to 13 to 30 years in prison. For the wrestling community, the loss of Dave Schultz was devastating. He had been more than an athlete. He was a mentor, a father, and a beloved figure who had given so much to the sport. His death left a void that no verdict or sentence could fill. For John DuPont, prison became his final chapter. Once a man who had hosted Olympians and lived in opulence, he spent his last years behind bars. In 2010, he died in prison at the age of 72. Imagine the contrast. A man who grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege, with every opportunity to shape a meaningful legacy, instead chose a path that destroyed lives and tainted his own name forever. The story of John DuPont is a haunting example that money cannot insulate someone from the consequences of violence. His tale was later dramatized in the film Foxcatcher, a reminder of how deeply his actions had cut into the world of sports and how unforgettable the tragedy remains. At its core, the case comes back to Dave Schultz, the man whose life was taken senselessly. He is remembered by family, friends, and wrestlers worldwide as a symbol of dedication and kindness. John DuPont, meanwhile, is remembered not for his philanthropy or his Olympic sponsorships, but for the moment when paranoia and violence consumed him, leaving behind a legacy not of greatness, but of ruin. Number 7. Charles Manson. For many, the name Charles Manson is less a person and more a symbol of chaos, violence, and the dark side of the 1960s counterculture. To some, he was a failed musician with big dreams. To others, he was a manipulator who built a following by preying on the vulnerable. By the end of the decade, he had become the face of one of the most infamous crime sprees in American history, one that left the nation shocked and forever changed how people thought about cults, celebrity, and the illusions of peace and love. Manson was born in 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a troubled young mother. His childhood was marked by neglect, time in reform schools, and a long string of petty crimes. By the time he reached adulthood, Manson was more familiar with prison cells than classrooms. But beneath the instability, he developed an uncanny ability to manipulate and persuade. When he was released from prison in 1967, he drifted to San Francisco during the height of the hippie movement. It was the summer of love, a time when young people were searching for meaning, community, and freedom. Manson seized the opportunity. He began gathering followers, mostly young women, who were drawn to his charisma and his message of love, freedom, and living outside society's rules. Calling themselves the Manson family, they lived communally, often on the fringes of California, moving from San Francisco to a ranch outside Los Angeles. Manson painted himself as a spiritual guide, blending ideas from the Bible, music, and his own twisted interpretation of social revolution. But beneath the talk of peace, he preached paranoia and violence. He told his followers of a coming race war he called Helter Skelter, borrowing the phrase from a Beatles song, and convinced them they would play a central role in it. By 1969, Manson's influence over his followers was total. They did what he said without question. On the night of August 8, 1969, he sent a group of them to a house in Los Angeles on Cielo Drive. The house had once belonged to music producer Terry Melcher, who had rejected Manson's ambitions to launch a music career. At the time, it was being rented by actress Sharon Tate, the 8 months pregnant wife of director Roman Polanski. That night, Tate and 4 others were brutally killed. The next evening, Manson ordered more killings, this time at the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a wealthy couple in Los Angeles. Together, the murders stunned the nation, not only for their brutality, but also for their randomness. Victims chosen not for personal reasons, but to send a message of fear and chaos. The investigation initially left the police scrambling. The crimes seemed random, the connections unclear. But gradually, the threads began to tie back to Manson and his followers. Arrests were made, and the shocking truth emerged: the charismatic drifter who once dreamed of. Being a rock star, had orchestrated multiple killings without lifting the weapon himself. His influence was so complete that his followers carried out his orders with chilling devotion. The trial that followed in 1970 was one of the most infamous in American history. Manson and several of his followers, including Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, were charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The courtroom became a circus, with Manson carving an X into his forehead, later turning it into a swastika, and his followers singing, chanting, and showing unwavering loyalty. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi laid out the theory of helter-skelter, explaining how Manson used paranoia and manipulation to push his followers into killing for him. In 1971, Charles Manson and his co-defendants were found guilty. Manson was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life in prison when California temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, repeatedly denied parole, until his death in 2017 at the age of 83. For decades, Manson remained a cultural figure, interviewed by the media, studied by criminologists, and invoked as the archetype of cult leadership gone wrong. His image, wild-eyed and ranting, became shorthand for evil in American history. Yet at the heart of the story are the victims: Sharon Tate, her unborn child, and the other lives lost in those 2 nights of violence. Their families lived with the grief long after the camera stopped rolling, a reminder that behind the spectacle was real human tragedy. Imagine living in Los Angeles in 1969, a time when the city was buzzing with Hollywood glamour and dreams of freedom, only to wake up to headlines describing unimaginable violence in a quiet neighborhood. The Manson murders shattered the illusion of peace in the era of love and left scars that never fully healed. Charles Manson's story is not one of fame or glory. It is the story of how manipulation and obsession can twist ideals into nightmares, and how one man's hunger for control left an indelible mark on history. His name may never be forgotten, but it is remembered not for music or meaning, but for orchestrating a crime spree that turned an entire era upside down. Number 8. Scott Peterson. In December 2002, a missing persons case out of Modesto, California, captured national attention. It began with a young, expectant mother who vanished without warning, just one day before Christmas Eve. Her name was Lacey Peterson. She was 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, and seemingly on the verge of the happiest chapter of her life. The story quickly spread across television screens and newspapers, drawing sympathy from millions who hoped she would be found safe. But as the days turned into weeks, attention shifted to her husband, Scott Peterson, a man whose calm public demeanor seemed increasingly at odds with the nightmare unfolding around him. Scott and Lacey had met while she was in college, and by all accounts, their relationship appeared idyllic. They married in 1997 and settled into a suburban life in Modesto. Friends described Lacey as radiant and full of energy, while Scott was seen as charming and ambitious. Together, they looked like the picture of a perfect young couple ready to start a family. When Lacey became pregnant in 2002, their joy seemed complete. But beneath that surface, investigators would later uncover cracks that painted a much darker reality. On December 24th, 2002, Scott reported Lacey missing. He told police she had gone out to walk their dog while he spent the morning fishing at the Berkeley Marina, over 90 miles away. Neighbors found the dog wandering the neighborhood with its leash still attached, but there was no sign of Lacey. From the beginning, something felt off. Police searched tirelessly, combing the nearby fields, rivers, and neighborhoods. Volunteers joined in, holding vigils and plastering posters across the community. But suspicion steadily turned toward Scott. As investigators dug deeper, troubling details emerged. Most damaging was the revelation that Scott had been having an affair with a woman named Amber Frey. She later came forward, saying Scott had told her he was single, and even suggested he had lost his wife before Lacey had disappeared. Those words, recorded on calls later played for the jury, would become crucial evidence. To the public, this was devastating. The grieving husband at the center of national sympathy was revealed to be leading a double life. The break in the case came in April 2003, when the bodies of Lacey and her unborn son were discovered along the San Francisco Bay, not far from where Scott had gone fishing on the day she vanished. The grim discovery erased any lingering hope and shifted the case from a missing person search to a homicide investigation. The proximity to Scott's alibi location was too strong to ignore. Police moved quickly, arresting him just days later in San Diego. He was found carrying thousands of dollars in cash, his brother's ID, and supplies that suggested he might be planning to flee. The trial began in 2004 and was covered wall to wall by the media. Prosecutors argued that Scott had planned the killing to free himself from the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood, motivated by his affair and desire for a different life. They presented forensic evidence linking him to the marina and emphasized his lies to Amber Frey as proof of his state of mind. The defense countered by pointing to the lack of direct physical evidence tying him to the deaths, suggesting that the case was built on circumstantial connections. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury was unconvinced. In November 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder for Lacey's death and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn child. The following month, he was sentenced to death. For Lacey's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, though no sentence could erase the pain of losing both a daughter and a grandson-to-be. Over the years, Peterson's case has continued to spark debate. Supporters argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that the media frenzy prejudiced the jury. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence due to issues with jury selection, but upheld his convictions. He was resentenced in 2021 to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Scott Peterson remains incarcerated. His name synonymous with one of the most infamous true crime cases of the 21st century. Imagine being part of a community that rallied to search for a missing woman, only to discover that the man leading the calls for help was the one responsible for her disappearance. The betrayal felt personal to many, and it's why the case continues to linger in public memory. Scott Peterson's story is one of a man who had every opportunity for a peaceful, happy life, a marriage, a family on the way, and a supportive community. Instead, he chose deception and destruction. For Lacey and her unborn son, their story remains a heartbreaking reminder of the fragility of trust and how quickly an image of perfection can unravel. Number 9. Jodi Arias. At first, Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander looked like a perfect couple. They met in 2006 at a professional conference in Las Vegas, and the connection between them seemed immediate. Travis, a charismatic motivational speaker and salesman from Arizona, was outgoing, ambitious, and deeply rooted in his Mormon faith. Jodi, originally from California, was artistic, striking, and eager to embrace the new relationship. To friends and family, it looked like a love story in the making. But underneath the smiles and photos, there was a storm brewing, a relationship marked by jealousy, obsession, and conflict. By 2008, it would explode in a crime that would dominate headlines for years. Jodi Arias grew up in Salinas, California, raised in an ordinary household. She was described as intelligent, creative, and independent, though she sometimes clashed with authority. Travis Alexander, meanwhile, had built his life around self-discipline and his faith. He had overcome a difficult childhood to find success in both his career and his church community. Their worlds collided at that conference in Las Vegas, and for Jodi, meeting Travis was transformative. She converted to his faith, was baptized in 2006, and soon moved closer to him in Mesa, Arizona. Friends of Travis, however, sensed problems early on. They described Jodi as deeply infatuated, sometimes to the point of being overwhelming, while Travis was more cautious about the relationship. Over time, the relationship turned rocky. They broke up, reconciled, and broke up again. Friends noticed Jodi showing up unannounced, checking his phone, and struggling to accept the end of their romance. Travis confided to those close to him that he was worried about her intensity and the way she seemed unable to let go. Despite their conflicts, they stayed in touch, a connection that would prove dangerous. On June 4th, 2008, Travis Alexander was scheduled to attend a business trip to Cancun with friends, but he never made it. After he missed important calls and meetings, his friends grew worried. On June 9th, they went to his home. What they found shocked them. Travis was dead in his bathroom. The scene was gruesome, and investigators immediately began piecing together what had happened. The sheer violence of the crime suggested rage and familiarity, leading detectives to look at those closest to him. Jodi Arias quickly became the prime suspect. At first, Jodi denied any involvement. She told police she hadn't seen Travis in months. But when confronted with evidence, including time-stamped photos found on a recovered camera that placed her in the house that very day, her story changed. She then claimed masked intruders had killed Travis, sparing her life. Later, her account shifted again, this time admitting she had killed him, but framing it as self-defense after a sudden attack. The shifting stories only deepened suspicion, and prosecutors argued she was lying to cover up a deliberate act. The trial, which began in 2013, became one of the most closely watched in recent memory. Televised and streamed across the country, it gripped audiences with its mix of shocking crime scene details, conflicting narratives, and the drama of Arias herself taking the stand for 18 days of testimony. Prosecutors argued that the killing was premeditated, pointing to evidence like her driving across states, filling gas cans to avoid tracking, and deleting photos from the camera. The defense countered by portraying her as a victim of emotional turmoil, claiming she acted in fear. After months of testimony, the jury reached a decision. In May 2013, Jodi Arias was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase dragged on through two separate juries, with some jurors pushing for the death penalty while others voted for life. Ultimately, in 2015, the judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Jodi Arias remains in prison in Arizona, serving her life sentence. She has filed appeals and given interviews, but her conviction stands. The case continues to fascinate the public, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the way it unfolded like a drama in real time, with Arias herself often at the center of the spectacle. Imagine being part of the jury, hearing her change her story again and again, never sure what version, if any, was true. Imagine being one of Travis's friends, knowing he had voiced concerns about Jodi, and then living with the knowledge that his worst fears came to pass. The story of Jodi Arias is one of obsession and escalation. What began as a whirlwind romance turned into one of the most notorious crimes of the 2000s. It leaves behind the haunting lesson that beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary relationships, there can be dangerous undercurrents waiting to rise. Number 10. Mark "Gator" Rogowski. In the world of skateboarding during the 1980s, few names carried as much weight as Mark "Gator" Rogowski. To young skaters, he wasn't just another athlete, he was a legend. With his bold tricks, wild energy, and magnetic personality, Gator represented the golden era of vert skating. His posters were tacked on bedroom walls, his signature boards flew off the shelves, and he seemed destined to stay at the top of the sport forever. But the same fame that once lifted him into the spotlight eventually became a weight he couldn't carry. By the early 1990s, his career had faded, his personal life spiraled, and the young man who had once inspired kids around the world committed a crime that shocked both his fans and the wider public. Mark Anthony Rogowski was born in 1966 in Brooklyn, New York, but grew up in California, where skateboarding was more than a pastime. It was a culture. By the time he was in his teens, Rogowski's natural talent was undeniable. He joined Vision Skateboards and became one of the biggest names in the sport. Known for his aggressive style and daring aerial moves, he quickly earned the nickname Gator. By the mid-1980s, Gator was everywhere. Magazines, commercials, and skate competitions that drew crowds eager to see him perform. He had money, fame, and an audience that adored him. But as street skating rose in popularity toward the end of the decade, Rogowski's vert-centered style lost the spotlight. Sponsorships dried up, and with them, the identity he had built his life around. Struggling to adjust, Rogowski's behavior grew erratic. He converted to evangelical Christianity in the early 1990s, trying to redirect his life, but he also developed a darker edge. Friends noted his jealousy, mood swings, and need for control, particularly in his romantic relationships. When his long-term girlfriend Brandy McLean broke up with him, it hit him hard. He became fixated on her, angry at her independence, and paranoid about losing influence over the people in his life. It was during this unstable period that he crossed paths with Jessica Bergston, a friend of Brandy's, who had recently returned to California after spending time abroad. On March 20th, 1991, Rogowski invited Jessica to his condominium in Carlsbad, California. Jessica was friendly and trusting, and she knew him through mutual friends, so she agreed. But what was supposed to be a casual meeting turned into a horrific crime. In his apartment, Rogowski attacked her, then placed her body in a surfboard bag. He drove out to the desert, leaving her remains in a remote area. For weeks, Jessica's family and friends searched for her, reporting her missing and hoping she would return. But there were no answers, no clear trail to follow. As the investigation dragged on, Rogowski began to unravel. Guilt weighed on him, and he sought counseling from a pastor. During one of those sessions, he confessed what he had done. That confession eventually reached law enforcement, and in May 1991, police arrested him. What had once been whispers about his strange behavior suddenly turned into a very public reckoning. Fans who had grown up idolizing Gator were stunned to hear the details. The man whose face had once been plastered across the skateboarding culture was now accused of a brutal killing. In court, Rogowski pled guilty to first-degree murder and sexual assault. There was no lengthy trial, no jury deliberation, just a swift and devastating conclusion. In 1992, he was sentenced to 31 years to life in prison. For the family of Jessica Bergston, the sentence was justice, though it could never replace the daughter, sister, and friend they had lost. For the skateboarding community, it was a painful reckoning. One of their heroes, someone who had defined an entire era of the sport, was revealed to be capable of an act that erased his legacy forever. Decades later, Rogowski remains in prison. He has become eligible for parole multiple times, but each request has been denied. In hearings, he has expressed remorse, admitting how his jealousy, anger, and inability to cope with failure led to choices that destroyed two lives, Jessica's and his own. His story has been told in documentaries and articles as a cautionary tale of fame, downfall, and the consequences of unchecked rage. Imagine being a teenager in the 1980s, clutching a gator skateboard and watching your hero soar through the air at competitions, never imagining that years later that same hero would be infamous not for his tricks, but for taking someone's life. Imagine being Jessica's family, hearing how she trusted a friend of a friend, only to never come home again. These contrasts are what make the case so haunting. The way fame and adoration can mask flaws that eventually spiral out of control. The legacy of Mark "Gator" Rogowski is not his championships or his tricks. Those accomplishments are overshadowed by the crime he confessed to and the life he destroyed. His story forces us to look at the darker side of celebrity, how adoration can sometimes hide instability, and how fame, once lost, can leave a void filled with dangerous impulses. Above all, it reminds us that behind the headlines and notoriety are victims whose lives must never be forgotten. For Jessica Bergsten's loved ones, the memory of who she was, kind, adventurous, and full of promise, is what matters most. And for the rest of us, the fall of Gator is a sobering reminder that heroes are not always what they seem.